Hi students, welcome to the last part of the histology lecture, at least the overview of different types of tissues that we cover in this class. Nerve tissue is going to be pretty distinctive in appearance. They are quite large cells with long cell processes. And a process is simply an extension of the cell. So it is an extension. There are several different types of processes that you'll see in neurons, which are your large cells that function for communication. Your neurons are going to be surrounded by smaller glial cells that lack these processes. Glial cells are support cells, so they serve a number of different functions depending on the type. We'll be talking about these functions once we get to the lecture on nervous tissue. Nerve tissue, of course, is specialized for internal communication between cells. So how you're able to sense hot and cold, how you are able to process the words that I'm saying and integrate this information in your brain, how you're able to see and interpret what you're seeing. All of this is due to the actions of our nerve tissue, specifically our neurons. So a neuron is going to be the large cells that you see within nerve tissue. This is found in the brain, spinal cord, nerves, and ganglia. Ganglia are just concentrations of cell bodies. And a cell body just describes the main part of a neuron rather than the processes, such as the axon or the dendrites, for example. So when you have a lot of these cell bodies concentrated in one area, that's what's known as a ganglion or plural ganglia. So this is a nice example of a neuron in high magnification. Neurons are known as stellate in shape, which means star-like. And the cell shape can be a bit variable, but you will see these processes. These are either going to be what are known as dendrites or axons. Sometimes it can be difficult to differentiate between those. The axon is what actually sends the signal from one cell to another, and that's what allows our cells to communicate with one another. You'll see one large nucleus in the cell, and then the smaller cells surrounding this are the glial cells. So here's a view of multiple neurons under lower magnification. So here's a neuron, here's another neuron, another neuron, another neuron. All of these large cells are your neurons, and then all of these tiny little cells that you see are the glial cells. So glial cells are actually far more numerous than neurons, but your neurons are going to serve the main functionality of nervous tissue, which is, of course, communication between various parts of the body. Okay, muscle tissue. There's 3 different types of muscle tissue that I'll cover here. These are elongated cells that will contract when they're stimulated by nerve tissue. So when you see that word contract, think shorten. What happens when a muscle cell contracts is the protein fibers in that individual muscle cell will overlap one another. So like in skeletal muscle, we have actin and myosin, which are the 2 main types of protein fibers. And normally, they'll be arranged where there's some kind of empty space within the cells. And when you actually have muscle contraction, you have more overlap between those fibers. So you end up having less space, and as a result, the whole muscle is going to shorten in length due to the overlap of the actin and myosin fibers. So what muscle tissue does is it exerts physical force on other tissues, causing movement, so limb movement, to push blood through a vessel. So our blood vessels will have the muscle tissue known as smooth muscle, and that causes vessels to either dilate or constrict. And, for example, expelling urine from the body, all of these tasks are accomplished by muscle tissue. They are also a source of body heat. So think about when it's cold outside and you start to shiver. Shivering is going to help generate body heat because the movement of those muscles is going to cause more body heat. That helps to warm you up. Histologically, there are three main types of muscle, and I'll cover each of these: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal muscle is, of course, found in our skeletal muscles. So muscles that are typically attached to bones and cause movement under our voluntary control. So they are long, cylindrical, unbranched cells with striations and multiple peripheral nuclei. Striations, these are just stripes, basically. Nuclei, of course, this is the control center of the cell where most of our DNA is held. And due to how skeletal muscles develop, you actually have the fusing of multiple precursor cells. And because they fuse together, you end up having multiple nuclei in a mature skeletal muscle cell. And those nuclei tend to be pushed out to the margins of the cells. That's why they're known as peripheral. So skeletal muscle is for movement, facial expression, posture, breathing, speech, swallowing, and excretion. And here's some examples of skeletal muscle. Right here we have a muscle fiber. Because individual muscle cells are so long, they're basically as long as the muscle that they are a part of. They're also known as muscle fibers. So a muscle cell, you'll see this when we get to muscle tissue physiology, also known as a muscle fiber. And you can see all of these little stripes here, those are the striations. And then multiple peripheral nuclei. So again, these are going to be pushed out towards the margins of the cell. So here we have another skeletal muscle fiber, multiple muscle fibers here, and then what you're seeing right here, these are muscle cells that are in cross section. So if we were to do a cut right here and turn this fiber on end, you'd be seeing the cross section. Now this is a really cool example of what's known as a motor end plate with skeletal muscle. So this is actually showing two different types of tissue. We have our skeletal muscle fiber here. It kind of looks like raw fish. That's what it reminds me of. So you have your skeletal muscle here, and then these are actually parts of a neuron. So this is part of nervous tissue, and this is actually where communication between a neuron and a skeletal muscle fiber will take place. So we have this process from a neuron here, and the motor end plate is this structure here, and this is where neurotransmitters are released, and that is going to stimulate the muscle fiber to actually contract. So this is a very beautiful example under high magnification. I have seen one of these in one of our skeletal muscle slides. Of course, it's not as nice of an example as this, but when you're looking at our skeletal muscle slides, keep in mind that this is something you might see. Not super common to actually see this in a cell or a preparation of cells that's been prepared just for purposes of viewing the muscle cells, but sometimes it happens. Another example of skeletal muscle, and again you're going to see those stripes, the striations. And then this also has a longitudinal view as well as the transverse view or the cross section. So this would be a cross section of a single fiber. Here's another one. And again, you get a good sense of the fact that these nuclei are kind of pushed out towards the periphery of the cell itself. For purposes of our in-class histology exam, when I'm asking you to identify tissue types with the aid of a microscope, I'm going to be showing you longitudinal views of our muscles rather than transverse, because it's going to be easier to get a sense of what that whole cell looks like with a longitudinal view rather than a transverse view. And then this is a myotendinous junction, so the junction between a skeletal muscle fiber and a tendon that will join a skeletal muscle to a bone. Okay, cardiac muscle. With cardiac muscle, we have short branched cells with striations and intercalated discs. There's one central nucleus per cell, and with cardiac muscle, you'll have what are known as gap junctions in between the cells, and that's a special type of protein apparatus that helps cells communicate with one another efficiently. And since this is really important in the cardiac tissue, cells have to communicate with one another, especially pacemaker cells. We have these gap junctions. And what an intercalated disc is, I'll be pointing these out on the tissue, but an intercalated disc is actually going to contain your gap junction as well as other types of protein that help adhere one cardiac muscle cell to another. With cardiac muscle, you of course only find this in the heart. Cardiac refers to heart, so you have pumping of blood by this muscle tissue, and it's very important that cells are able to efficiently communicate with one another, and it's also really important that enough force can be generated with cardiac muscle contraction to efficiently pump blood throughout the body. So here's a nice example. We have striations. It's not quite as obvious as in some of those skeletal muscle slides, but these fine little lines are your striations. And then the intercalated discs, I'm going to just trace over a few here. This would be an intercalated disc. This would be an intercalated disc. So basically this is showing you the boundaries of your cell. So that would be one cardiac muscle cell right here. And the cell shape can be somewhat variable. It can also be a little bit tricky seeing all of your intercalated discs, but if you see striated muscle that has these more obvious stripes, those are your intercalated discs. That's going to be indicative of cardiac muscle. And with cardiac muscle, you typically just see one central nucleus. Transverse section, again, this is cross section. It's going to be harder to differentiate between muscle tissue types. Just looking at transverse sections, it's usually a better diagnostic tool to look at it in a longitudinal section. Another view of cardiac muscle with our intercalated discs. This one has really obvious intercalated discs. So they look kind of just like gaps in this case. And then a view with less magnification, again your intercalated discs. And all of our histology slides with cardiac muscle tissue actually are just labeled as intercalated discs. So you'll notice this when you're doing the second part of the histology lab. Okay, smooth muscle, the last type of muscle tissue. These are short fusiform cells, so they're somewhat torpedo-shaped. It can be kind of difficult to see the boundaries between one cell and another, but basically this is the shape of these cells. It's going to be fusiform. They are non-striated, so there's none of those little stripes that we saw with cardiac and skeletal muscle. hence the name smooth, and there's only one central nucleus per cell. Where do you find smooth muscle? You find it in sheets of muscle within the viscera, which refers to our internal organs, the iris of the eye, hair follicles, and sphincters, which control movement of material out of the body. It's very important for the following functions: swallowing, the latter part of swallowing that we don't actually have conscious control over will be regulated by smooth muscle contractions. GI tract, gastrointestinal tract functions, labor contractions, control of airflow, as well as erection of hairs and control of the pupil, which controls how much light gets into our eye. So another example of smooth muscle here. Again, it can be difficult to actually determine where the cell boundaries are. Kind of have to use your imagination, especially with a lighter stained specimen like this. They are going to be roughly fusiform, and you'll see this large central nucleus. And again, longitudinal section, and then transverse or cross section up here. And then our last example of this, this would be an artery and a vein. The artery here is going to have a thicker wall than the vein. There's typically more blood pressure within your arteries than your veins, so in a preparation like this, a vein will typically appear kind of collapsed, whereas an artery will still have this open appearance. So all of this tissue right here is your smooth muscle. So all the way around this artery, that's what ultimately controls how relaxed or dilated or constricted your artery and other blood vessels are. Okay, as always, please let me know if you have any questions about any of this material, and thank you for listening.